everyone. We wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all for joining us today. This podcast was recorded and is made available to you by Whitley Penn LLP and WP Wealth LLP solely for informational purposes. The information, views, and opinions expressed in this podcast are general in nature and are not intended to be construed as the provision of financial or investment advice by Whitley Penn or WP Wealth. The information discussed in this podcast is accurate as of the day it was recorded, but may then become outdated over time. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions, comments, or concerns in regard to the content presented. Thank you again for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on another episode of WP Talks. I'm your host today, Bree Miller, joined by a very familiar voice, Tom Rein, a partner in our WP Wealth group. If you've been tuning in to our series, Navigating Through, then you joined us on what was a very unprecedented year. We kind of kicked off this series by talking about our initial reactions to the coronavirus and the immediate impact it had on the market. We discussed the actions taken by the Fed and the Treasury in the form of stimulus. We journeyed through an election cycle. We shared some of our thoughts on the different platforms the candidates were running on. And last time we spoke, we had the results in from the presidential election. We're awaiting confirmation and also awaiting the runoff for the 2 seats in Senate in Georgia. So with the flip of the calendar, we wanted to kick off the new year by getting back together, reviewing the outcome of those races, and sharing some of our thoughts on how a change in power might affect the economy and the stock markets going forward. So, Tom, we know we now have a Democratic-controlled White House, a narrowly controlled Democratic majority in the Congress. In fact, of the 535 legislators in Congress, the Democratic Party holds a majority by just 10 representatives. And I find that interesting because I think that narrow split, or that almost equal split, is really representative of the American population and kind of where we stand. How do you see this narrow divide or this narrow majority affecting the kind of legislation that's going to come out of this administration, at least for the next 2 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, Happy New Year. Certainly last year was crazy. We're all hoping that 2021 brings us a little more calmer events, but we're looking forward. Obviously, we're a month into the year and so much has happened already, but yeah, that's a great question. I think, to your point, you had mentioned just the very slim hold that the Democrats had in just pure numbers in both the House and the Senate. But when you think about the election in general, just, some of the states that come to mind, Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona and Nevada, that, were must-wins for Biden, which ultimately gave him the White House. You're talking about tens of thousands of votes. So not only is, I think, the tone of the electorate represented in such a narrow way in Washington, but I think the pure vote resembled that nationally as well. And I think that's important because, during the campaign, there were two very different platforms. Obviously we knew what the Trump administration was about. We had 4 years of history, and like him or not, you were able to make an evaluation based on his policies. And, now President Biden took a very different approach, led by voices such as AOC and Sanders and Warren. There was some real concern that the Biden administration would be starkly different, right, left, however you want to categorize that, than what we had in Trump. But I think it's important to note that the American people didn't necessarily cast their votes in that direction. So just the narrowness in Congress and as we saw with the vote, America is right down the middle. And so whether rhetoric was spoken to get into the White House. It'll be very interesting to see how the new administration legislates, because ultimately they're going to have to go back in 2 years in midterms to run again. So the American people, I think, gave their opinion. They wanted a change in the White House. They didn't necessarily want to change drastically in Congress. So this is the kind of the landscape that we're working with now.
Mm-hmm. So possibly some moderate policies to come out.
Would hope.
Yeah.
Would hope.
But yeah, and President Biden, like you said, did run on a specific policy platform that seemed a little bit more left-leaning to many. And right out of the gate, he has gone full force trying to implement that policy by way of executive orders. For example, as recent as December, Congress passed on a bipartisan basis nearly $1 trillion in a stimulus package. And President Biden is already pushing for an additional $1.9 trillion on top of that. And it looks like a lot of the same spending provisions as the previous package. So how do you see the appetite for spending out of this administration and the promise for continued support from the Fed and the Treasury affecting the economy and the continued growth of the markets?
It's really interesting. I think, we saw it, at least the last couple administrations, the use of executive orders and legislation through reconciliation, which basically is a departure from the traditional, bipartisan negotiating and kind of policy making or deal making between the House and the Senate. And unfortunately, anytime you do something like that, it's temporary in nature. In other words, like the Affordable Care Act with the Obama administration spent years in court because it wasn't passed through normal legislation. So, my sense is right out of the gate with all these executive orders and the threat on budget reconciliation is that the Biden administration is just racing to undo everything that Trump had put into place. I mean, there's no love lost, obviously, and part of that, some of that, I think, is just trying to erase the past and put a stamp or at least appease the constituents that voted Biden in, that he's undoing, the Trump administration. I think even some people in his own party question some things like XL pipeline and some of the job-killing measures that were initially enacted right out of the gate. But to your point on the spend side, it's interesting because we haven't really even spent the $1 trillion that came out in December yet. A lot of those programs are being initiated and they take some time to be implemented. And already we're talking about spending another $1.9 trillion, largely on the same type programs: PPP, direct stimulus, unemployment benefits, COVID relief. Yet, we look at the stock market. We listen to some of the Fed governors who talk about 2021 potentially being a really robust economic year. They're talking about 4 or 5% GDP growth in the second half. So it raises the question, in what we see without a new stimulus plan, if we think we're going to grow the economy by 4 and 5%, do we really need to spend $1.9 trillion on programs that already have not been funded yet? And I think, again, my opinion is that a lot of this is appeasing the electorate, that, unfortunately, politicians try to influence power by giving things to people where they think they can positively impact or have a positive perception. And I think it'll be really tough for the Republicans if Biden and company are viewed as givers, even if the economy maybe doesn't need it. It's going to be really challenging. But I think we just scratched the surface. You're talking about a $1.9 trillion stimulus package, and in my opinion, the minute that's done, we'll probably start talking about infrastructure. Then we'll start talking about some of the other platform positions on green energy and some other social programs. So I think the first 6 to 8 months of the administration is going to be focused on spending. So as it relates to the economy and the stock market, I think it'll be really positive. Trillions of dollars of printed money, if you will, making its way into the marketplace. It's got to be stimulative. It's got to continue to add fuel for stock price valuation gains. The Fed has already said that they're going to be there, with Fed policy that's highly accommodative. They're going to keep rates low. They're going to let inflation run, a tad higher than target, just to make sure that the economy is growing significantly. So I think for the economy and the market, it's really positive because I think there's going to be a ton of spending to at least what we've sensed so far through some of the commentary coming out of Washington right now.
Right. And you highlighted some of those outside of stimulus in the form of spending for infrastructure and green energy and social programs. And we already know that the national debt is currently above $27 trillion. And if there's not some form of offsetting revenue for these kinds of spending programs, then obviously we can anticipate a continued increase in national debt. President Biden ran on the platform of tax reform, specifically changes to individual and corporate rates, capital gains rates, some changes to state law. How do you see him, generating the revenue to support these spending programs? And if it is in the form of tax law reform, how will that impact the market?
Yeah, that's the big question. Generally, increasing taxes is not great for the economy, and I think the degree upon the extreme nature of policy moving forward will probably depend on the strength of the economy. So if the economy is fairly weak, I think President Biden and all his advisors are smart enough to understand that you can't knock the legs out from the economy when it's just beginning to get traction. So I do think that he in order to influence or to reconcile his policy pledges, he would make changes to tax policy, but probably not material. I think what we've learned in the last many years, and certainly under Trump administration as well as the Biden administration, or as well as the Obama administration, is Congress has gotten a sweet tooth to borrowing. Where we used to have some fiscal constraint on levels of debt, I think that's gone out the window. So I think that's an easy source to go back to, is deficit spending. As long as there's an appetite around the world to buy our debt, I think that would be a favored way of getting revenue, or getting liquidity to fund these programs. Obviously, interest rates are essentially zero, so carry cost is next to nothing. I think if the economy improves to a level that gives Washington confidence that it can withstand higher taxes, then I think we got to be careful. We heard yesterday that Senator Warren is talking about a wealth tax. That's a theme she's been pushing for a lot of years now. But maybe we're closer to that as a way of generating. Obviously, we have to generate revenue somehow. When we're spending trillions of dollars that we don't have every year, there's got to be an offset. And I think those with wealth and with higher incomes are certainly targets, whether it's increasing the estate tax, generating a wealth tax, raising income or payroll taxes. You got to be really careful that you don't take the incentives away from capital markets and from business formation. And I think that's a tight wire walk that you're making right now, given the fragile nature of the economy due to COVID. So it's going to be interesting. I think, as I mentioned, I think the first 6 to 8 months they're going to focus on spending, and I think after that we're going to get a sense for where the economy is and what their attitude is for tax policy. And I think that's where the risk to the market and the economy comes in. Certainly as wealth advisors, we're concerned when we hear things like doubling the capital gains tax rate and raising or mitigating the financial impact of using qualified plans as tax deferral features, and doubling or increasing the payroll tax above for those earning over $400,000. I think that will largely affect our clients, and I think would probably not be great for the incentive to take risk in the capital markets and other form of investment. So something we're certainly watching and trying to understand where the momentum is going on that.
Right. It'll be interesting to see as we continue to see recovery in the economy, kind of how that shapes out.
Yeah, I think time will tell. If the Fed governors are right, if we're growing at 4 or 5%, I think there would be a lot more appetite for the Democrats to start pushing major, material tax reform. But I think if we're still fragile, if unemployment is still high, if small businesses are still suffering coming out of the COVID shutdown and trying to get their feet up, probably would not make sense. And then you're right back again. If it takes most of this year to spend, and then we start talking about taxes, you're right into another election cycle, and the American people can make their opinion on whether they like what's going on or not. And as you kick this thing off and talking about how thin the margins are in the House, and then obviously 50-50 in the Senate, it wouldn't take a lot for either the House or the Senate to flip, which would take the ability for an administration to pass material changes at that point.
Mm-hmm. One of the topics that I think listeners might find interesting in starting to understand is kind of the difference in administrations as it relates to foreign policies. So we know the Trump administration was very pro-America first. There was tariffs implemented on various economies around the world. We withdrew from the Paris Agreement that addresses climate change, imposed sanctions on Iran, and implemented a trade deal with China. And we've seen President Biden already start to reverse some of those policies. How do you think this administration's relationship with foreign economies and foreign leaders is similar or different from the previous?
Yeah, and I go back to the activity on the executive orders right out of the gate. Biden basically reversed not everything, but a lot of what Trump had done. And like him or not, and a lot of people don't, obviously, the economy was fairly strong, and I believe part of that was the strong position that he took with world leaders and with other economies around the globe, whether it be through tariffs or just the way he negotiated. I think certainly that, our unemployment rate was very, very low. Our economy was growing. Wealth indicators were strong across all segments of the population. And in, coming out and undoing a lot of that raises an eyebrow as to whether the Biden administration is just trying to put Trump as a distant memory and kind of snubbing the nose to those policies, or whether they truly have a different philosophy and how it relates to the rest of the world. Obviously, prior administrations, many of them, not just one, allowed China to get to the position they were in growing their economy and taking advantage of the U.S. in trade, and not just China but other countries. And so whether this was a reaction to Trump or whether it's part of a strategic plan, we're going to have to wait and see. We certainly saw benefits of the approach that Trump took, and so it's hard to see that clarity yet in the Biden policy structure. Just the fact that it was just more of undoing and not of doing. So we'll see. It's early. We're only a month or so into his administration, so I'm not going to cast in stone what his position is. But some other things I think from a world standpoint, which I think is interesting. One of the things is energy independence that we created here domestically. It's hard to remember the last time there was significant conversation about the Middle East from a threats perspective, and largely that's because we became energy independent. And so where we spent generations dealing in the Middle East in conflict and lives lost, largely because of oil. That was not necessarily the case as we became energy independent. So with the canceling of the XL pipeline, with some of the other policy decisions, I hope we don't revert to a situation where we're entertaining conversations again, like we have in the past, that hopefully policy decisions are in place that continue to build on some of the good that happened with some of the Trump administration's decisions. Again, it's early. It's only February. It's less than a month since Biden's been in office. There's been a lot of activity. So you can only evaluate based on what you've seen. But time will tell as it relates to the Paris Accord and greenhouse gases and the environment. Obviously the Democrats have a much stronger pro-environmental policy stance than what the Trump administration did. That's fine. We'll see how that impacts the economy. We know there's a lot of parts of the economy right now that's upset, that they feel threatened as we shift. We've been told that those jobs will be replaced. So, time will tell. And then, fortunately, we have elections every 2 years that would, constituents can vote their opinion on whether they agree with that or not. But certainly it's, 2021 is going to be very interesting for lots of different reasons than 2020 was. I think we're generally optimistic that we've got the vaccine. We see light at the end of the tunnel, that the economy can begin to emerge from what was just devastating. That small business owners hopefully are going to be able to get back in opening their businesses up, and people are going to go back to work and to school, and maybe we'll get a sense of a little more normalcy, and hopefully the environment in Washington calms a bit, and maybe negotiation and compromise will be the theme going forward. At least that's what we hope for.
Mm-hmm. Yep, interesting points and perspectives. And to your point, only time will tell how this administration is going to take shape. And, we'll look to get back together as we see that kind of start to form, to provide some clarity to our listeners and kind of share our thoughts on and how that might impact going forward. With that, I want to thank you for joining us today. Continue to look for our releases of podcasts wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, look for us on our website at WPWealth.com and give us a follow on LinkedIn. Again, we'll see you guys soon, and thanks.
Great. Thank you.